The UK is experiencing a Category 4 heat wave. I've never heard of that before, but it doesn't sound good. In some cases, some of the ocean areas are seeing an increase of sea surface temperature 4 to 5 degrees above normal June levels. How's that going to affect the environment and the important fish species like cod and mackerel? We're going to find out on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. In today's episode, we've got some bad news, folks. We're getting a heat wave in the UK around all the UK waters. It's a little scary, I'm not going to lie. It's not something that we feel good about as scientists or just as citizens of this planet. This is something that we don't want to happen, but we're seeing like extreme cases. We're seeing sea surface temperatures in some areas that are 4 to 5 degrees Celsius higher than the long-term average for mid-June. That's what we're really looking at here. A lot of times, you're probably hearing the number of 1.5 degrees above, what the normal average was back in, 2-3 decades ago. That's what we're not supposed to go above. Unfortunately, we just keep seeing these increases, the extreme cases of increases. Now, has this happened before? No. Is this uncommon? Absolutely. Hopefully we don't see this again. However, this is supposed to be an El Nino year. It's supposed to be hot. Certain areas are affected more than others. And in this case, we see a heat wave in the most intense in the northern North Sea, northwest of Ireland, and in the Celtic Sea between Cornwall and Southern Ireland. These areas actually have deeper waters with weaker tidal currents, leading to stratification, where a layer of warmer water overlays over a cooler, deeper layer. And that's stratification. That's where it becomes really important, especially the effect of this heat wave on fish, plankton, crustaceans, and so forth. However, and I'll talk about that in a second, but however, in contrast, shallower areas like the southern North Sea, the English Channel, and the southern Irish Sea have sea surface temperatures only slightly above normal. So it's not bad in all areas. Oceans, they tend to have a little bit of a slower rate of temperature change, so they'll be compared to the atmosphere. So making extreme temperatures, devastations are rare. However, this is pretty extreme in this case. The heat wave could negatively impact marine ecosystems, particularly in biologically productive continental shelf areas around Britain and Ireland. So essentially what happens is stratification caused by the heat wave may diminish nutrient mixing from deeper waters to the sea surface layer, potentially affecting plankton and fish that rely on them. So this is what happens essentially. Fish like cod and mackerel, they eat smaller fish. That's what they eat. Those smaller fish eat plankton, whether it be zooplankton or phytoplankton. That plankton is dependent on nutrient-rich waters that come in from the deep. So if you don't have those nutrient waters coming in because of that stratification, that food availability for those smaller fish diminishes. And the food availability, in essence, for the larger fish diminishes because those small fish may not be healthy or they may not be around. They could starve if this stratification lasts for a long time. And look, this is not just the only effect that could happen on these fish. There's other cumulative effects, water quality. If you're close to shallow areas and coastal areas, looking at coastal development, you're looking at predation by other animals. When you bring in heat, a lot more heat, it could affect the physiological systems of these animals. It's not an easy thing to deal with. This is something that we as scientists and we as conservationists always have to be careful of these problems when you're looking at heat, you're looking at phytoplankton, and you're looking at stratification. Now, in another example of this, not necessarily affecting due to climate change or affecting, well, it could be due to climate change, but affecting fish populations in this way. But I remember working in Louisiana, where, the Gulf of Mexico, where one of the major projects was looking at the plume of the Mississippi and how far it extended out during the summer months. Essentially what happens is during the spring months, Mississippi puts out its plume, and all of the phytoplankton that spring out during spring the population and abundance of that phytoplankton is dependent on the nutrient availability from the Mississippi River, as well as the heat from the atmosphere and from the water temperatures. So if you get a good mix and you get enough phosphate, because that's that limiting factor sometimes, enough phosphate in that water from, fertilizers and any other type of non-point sources that come in from farms and other sort of sources, they come in, they feed the phytoplankton bloom, and depending on that bloom and how far the plume pushes out that water into the Gulf of Mexico, you'll get just a crazy mix of massive plankton blooms for the spring along the northern part of the Gulf of Mexico. That plankton eventually will die off during the summers, and it will just sink to the bottom. Now, because the summers there's not a lot of mixing, it stratifies because the weather gets warmer, the winds die down. You're going to see the bottom layer just full of dead phytoplankton, which gets eaten up by the microbial loop, so bacteria. Bacteria, when they actually eat up the phytoplankton, they use oxygen to eat it up. So you get so if there's enough phytoplankton to eat up, you could get a hypoxic layer, so a layer without oxygen in the bottom 1.5 meters at sea. Now, it varies in different places, but there's a lot of studies on that, by Dr. Nancy Rabelais and her colleagues, and it's a big thing. Sometimes it can stretch, 22,000 square kilometers. Sometimes it's smaller, sometimes it's larger. It depends on where that plume, so where that water exiting the Mississippi and how that Mississippi pushes that fresh water in with all that plankton into the ocean where it mixes. And then it just drops that phytoplankton in the summer. You get stratification, and then you're not getting any mixing. So that dead phytoplankton, just sits at the bottom, gets eaten up by the microbial loop. Oxygen gets taken in, methane gets put out, and you get more greenhouse gases. So, that's a long explanation of what can happen in a different area. Will this happen in, areas in the UK? That I don't know. It all depends on the system. It all depends on how everything lands. Right now, the important part is getting rid of this layer of heat that's 4 to 5 degrees in some areas, more than the normal averages of mid-June, and trying to get a mix and trying to get deeper, cooler water that's nutrient rich that can help feed those little fish that help the cod and mackerel sort of eat those big fish, and haddock and feed those big fish. So this is something that's extremely important. It's not good news, obviously, and I don't want to start off your Monday with some bad news. However, it's something that we need to discuss. This is where the call to action is, we need to do more for climate change. It seems like this year we're going to get a lot of extremes. We've already seen some major wildfires here in Canada that's affecting air quality and just personal recreation for a lot of people, and just wondering about personal safety for a lot of people, not only in the areas that are affected, but where that wind blows, and seeing how air quality can really affect areas like where I am in Southern Ontario, in New York, in Quebec, in Northern Ontario, all over the place, all across Canada as well. And so, we're seeing these extreme events happen earlier, which is scary. This could just be one of those years where it's going to be an extreme, but it doesn't mean that it means that we just dismiss it. We need to address climate change. We need to vote in politicians that are going to address climate change. Currently here in Canada, we have a Conservative Party that wants to do anything but address climate change, and that scares the heck out of me. I don't care if someone's conservative or someone's liberal or someone's from the NDP or someone is a Republican or Democrat. We all need to come together. We all need to worry about climate change and make sure we reduce the effects of climate change by voting in people who will put in policies that will reduce climate change. That's really what it comes down to. That's the biggest thing that you can do at this point. So if there's an election coming around, or you're talking to your MPs or your representatives at any level, it's time to really start to put the pressure on them and say, hey, we need to do something about climate change. This is something that's scary. This is something that we need to address. And if we don't address it, we're going to see changes around the world. It's not going to be in just developing countries like we've normally seen. They tend to get, unfortunately, the major effects. But now it's starting to affect developed countries. And I think we'll start to see more movement here because, look, we need to do something. We've needed to do something for a long time. And unfortunately, it's taken this level to start doing something. So hopefully you can talk to your MPs. Hopefully you can talk to your local politicians and say, hey, we need to do something. What's your plan? And if they don't have a plan, just be like, if you don't have a plan, maybe you don't get my vote next time, right? That's important for them. That's really important to them. Anyway, that's it. It's a short and sweet one today, folks. If you have any questions, or if you're doing anything with your politicians, or you're engaging with your politicians, I would love to hear about it. DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. I would really love to hear about it, and even come on the show. There's a Calendly link in the show notes. You can check it out along with the article here. But I'm really interested to see what you have to say about how you deal with politicians or interact with politicians about climate change and any other important environmental sort of influences or events that are happening in your part of the world. So hit me up, Calendly. We'll get something together and we'll interview you. You can be on the podcast. You don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to be a policy person. You just have to be someone who's interested in the ocean, interested in the environment and protecting that environment. So check it out. DM me if you have any questions at How to Protect the Ocean. If you want to be on the show, hit up my Calendly link and pick a time. And I look forward to talking to you and engaging with you after this episode. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.